A woman did come forward to us after the arrest of the Braemar Hill gang. And she gave a statement to us saying that she'd been raped by a single male. The fruit seller, I think maybe she's still selling fruit, I don't know, but she was of no, no value.
Was there a fruit seller?
I have no idea, and as I said, if there was, I wouldn't have wasted 1 microsecond in even pursuing it.
What was your reaction when you saw the guy?
I just knew immediately, just by instinct, that's the right guy. He just looked a really strange character. Anyway, we arrested him, and he looked pretty evil.
Sean Ho-Tung, Dangerous Person 2.0, English channel. Welcome to Dangerous Persons 2.0. I'm Sean Ho-Tung. My wife, Mary, invited me to pick a Hong Kong murder case and give an analysis of it. What came to mind immediately for me was the Braemar Hill murder cases. I was in Hong Kong at the time. This occurred on 20th April 1985. I think I was around 20 years old at that time. So as I recall, when the news came out about what had happened, I remember getting personally very, very angry and even a little afraid from, what I was hearing that had occurred. Braemar Hill is actually in Tai Tam Country Park, and the sources I'm using for this will be court orders, some anonymous sources from online, some YouTube presentations already done, and Kate Whitehead's Hong Kong Murders book. The victims in this case was Kenneth McBride and Nicola Myers. These were two young students who were in a relationship, and they went to the Island School on 20 Boret Road in the mid-levels. They were very popular. They were well known and liked at school. Kenneth was on his debate team. He was a captain of the rowing team. He was the president of the student union. Nicola was a very bright, beautiful young lady who specialized in language. She was learning Cantonese and Mandarin, and my understanding, it was her hope that she could become an interpreter at the United Nations. So these two kids were studying for their A-level exams. And as was their custom, they would go to Braemar Hills. They'd walk up there and find a nice quiet spot, and they'd study together. They'd bring their school books with them and study there. They were also in love with each other. On the 20th April, this is what they did. They went up to the Braemar Hills and looked for this quiet spot. To their misfortune, some other people were on that hill that same day. And these were 5 Chinese men and boys. I'll identify them first, and then I'll just refer to them by their surnames. So the boys were Wong Sam Lung, age 15. Second boy was a Chee-hwa man, 25 years old. The men were Chung Ya Hang, age 16. Ham Si Fu, 21 years old. And the ringleader, Pan Xiong Yi, age 26. Now, some sources said Pang was actually staying in a hut in that area, scouting it out. And other sources say they all came over from Kowloon on that day. Regardless, it was Pang's idea that they would go up and down the hill here to seek out aerial electrical substations, in order to break through these wire gates and steal the copper wiring, which they would then take back to Kowloon and sell. Hard day's work for them. Unfortunately, well, I don't know, unfortunately or not, but anyway, they're going up and down the hill all day. They're unable to get through any of these barbed wire fences to get access to the copper wires. So they're getting pretty frustrated. It's a hot day. And as they're roaming about these hills, going from point to point, they spot Kenneth and Nicola. It's Pang's idea that they will use a pincer movement and rush the couple. By using the pincer movement, they prevent anyone from escaping. So what happens is 2 of them go for Nicola. Those 2 were Chung and Wong. So those 2 attacked Nicola, and the other 3 attacked Kenneth, or initially boxing them in, and demanded the money. Kenneth turned over $1, and apparently he pulled his pockets out, showing he didn't have any more money, and allegedly this infuriated Pang. However, later in court, it came out from Wong that they saw the couple and they said, let's go down there, rob them, and have some fun. That came out in court. Kenneth, while he was in good shape, had only one arm. He had a sporting injury, so his other arm was in a sling. There are disputes whether it was a torn muscle or a broken collarbone, but the bottom line was he only had one arm. When the three people attacked him, they severely beat him. They obviously overcame him. He only had one arm, and they tied his hands and they tied his feet and left him there. And while that was happening, the 15-year-old Wong and Tung was attacking and holding Nicola down. Now that Kenneth has been immobilized, neutralized, the order is given to Chew to go and be the lookout. So he goes to be the lookout, and the other four go down, move Nicola a little bit down, so they're separated them a bit. It's never quite clear how much they separated them, but Kenneth is a little higher up, and they pull Nicola a little down. I don't know if it's 10 feet or 20 feet. What happened, according to the judgment from the Court of Appeal, case number 40-1987, is that Pang raped Nicola, and while he's doing this, the other three are, quote unquote, inflicting gross sexual indignities to the girls. So this lasted for about 20 minutes. However, when we go and take a look at the judgment of Criminal Appeal Court, appeal number 165, year 2005, the entire attack lasted approximately 4 hours. So in other words, within the first 20 minutes, Nicola has been raped. And three of the other people have been committing sexual indecent assault while she's being raped. And we also know that Kenneth is immobilized, hands and feet are tied. Both have been severely beaten, and the significance is what I've found, what I've read from other sources, except for some of the judges here, is that no one has actually given proper consideration to the 3.5 hours after the first 20 minutes. After the first 20 minutes is done, the lookout, Chew, is called to come back to the group. And so for 3 hours and 40 minutes, these 5 people continue to assault, abuse, torture, and rape Nicola. Nicola was raped at least by 2 different individuals. The only time they took a break was to have cigarettes. So you think about that, because I've seen some YouTube commentators actually laughing and joking when they recount the events of Braemar Hill murders. In Kate Whitehead's book, she does say Nicola was raped and abused and tortured, and that Kenneth had been killed first. But that just kind of, it's a bit of a whitewash. So let's be clear. Kenneth had over 100 wounds on him, okay? He was continuously beaten. And the worst part of this, bearing in mind this took 4 hours, is that Kenneth can hear what is happening to Nicola. Maybe he even can see it, but he can definitely hear it. And then on the other side of that, you have Nicole, who has over 500 wounds. This is not a simple rape, 500 wounds. And Nicole, she gets to hear Kenneth suffering his 100 injuries. This is not a simple murder rape. And a lot of that's glossed over. It's a sex case. It's a sexual assault case. I find it quite irritating and annoying that actually some of these people have gotten out of jail. You know, sure, they might have served 10 or 20 years, whatever, but it seems people forgot what happened on that hill. One doesn't want to really get into details, but I think you need to. And so we'll go back to Nicole here. So she suffers multiple rapes, She had a stick and a bottle put inside her. Her jaw was broken. Her left eye had been knocked out of its socket. She had multiple head injuries. Okay, this happened to this poor girl for 4 hours. So whenever one of these guys wanted to come out to appeal, I do not understand why the prosecution did not bring this back up. And her facial expression in death was of horrible suffering. Now, we see at page 3 from case number 40, 1987, that Pang, Wong, Tam, Chung were hitting Kenneth with a stick. And this stick is the main weapon throughout. Anyway, this stick is then placed across Kenneth's throat. And 2 of them will hold the stick on each side, and the other 2 jump on the stick. They're trying to snap the guy's neck. And it is Pang and Tam who's holding the stick, and they're forcing Wong and Chu to jump on it. Pang gets upset because they're not jumping hard enough. So he tells them, let's switch positions. So now Wong and Chu, they hold the stick across Kenneth's throat. And Tam and Pang start jumping on the stick. They still can't break his neck, apparently. But, or if they do, they don't realize it. So what happens next is Tam takes the sling, the arm sling that was on Kenneth, and he holds one end of it, and Pang holds the other end of it. They put it around the boy's neck, and they both pull. And then Pang finally announces he's dead. At that announcement, he then tells the other 3 to go down and kill Nicola. They head down there with the stick, and they start hitting her again. Pang and Tam then go down the hill to join the other 3. And as usual, Pang is not satisfied with how hard one is hitting the victims here. So he takes over and he starts using the stick to hit Nicola, and the stick breaks and into 2. He continues doing it with the broken stick. So I'll just read what follows directly from the judgment. D1 and D2, D1 is Pang, D2 is Tam, joined them, meaning the other 3, and also used a stick to hit the girl. The stick broke, and the broken part was then placed across the girl's neck, and the same procedure was followed as with the boy. The girl was still alive, and Wong...
D4 is Chung, and D5 is Chu.
Were told to stand aside, while D1, Pang, and D2, Tam, hit her again with the stick, which broke for a second time. Shortly after, the stick had been put to another use. I think you know what that means. They all left. The medical evidence in respect of the girl was that her death resulted from multiple injuries, in particular head injuries. Shock contributed because shock would have made the effect of the injuries greater. As to the boy, he died from asphyxiation due to the pressure on the neck, which was unlikely to have come from the piece of cloth which Pang and Tam pulled tight, and more likely to have been caused by the manner in which the stick had been used upon him. So that's in this court judgment, number 40 of 1987. I cannot emphasize strongly enough that you have to remember the details, because I believe 2 of these guys have actually gotten out. Tam, the D2, he died in prison. He caught cancer and he died in prison. Pang is still in prison. So I believe the 2 young ones, Wong and Chu, got out. But I'll save that for another episode, or part 2 follow-up. Now, let's get to the background to the arrest. It takes the police 8 months to catch these guys. The good thing here is that during this time, thousands of tips came in. I think at one point they had
180,000 leads.
And all this was paper in the old days, or phone calls, you write it down on paper. So in the UK at the same time, the British had developed a system had developed a computer system. So one of the detectives, I think his name was Trevor Collins, flew over to the UK, learned how to use the computer system, came back to Hong Kong, and thus implemented this computer system in Hong Kong. And what happened was 180,000 leads had been reduced to, was somehow reduced to approximately 180 suspects, although none of those suspects were actually the killers and the rapists. But still, so you have an administrative plus here on enabling the Hong Kong police to free up a lot of time and follow other leads thanks to this computer innovation. Another issue was forensics regarding fingerprints. And at that time in Hong Kong, it was just beginning. And this was problematic because after the 5 criminals had killed the 2 victims, they tore up all the school books and tried to get rid of the evidence. And one of the pieces of evidence was the stick, and they had thrown that into a stream. What occurred was the father, I believe of Kenneth, got worried when the kids didn't come back around 7 p.m. He called the Myers. The Myers said, they're not here. And at about 1 a.m., he went out with a flashlight, and he tried to go up and down the hill. He couldn't find anything. So he retired. The next morning, he came up with more people. They looked around, and they found some of the school books being torn. So they immediately called the Hong Kong police. So that's the first alert, the day after. However, it's a bank manager who's jogging up on the Braemar Hills here, and he sees 2 bodies. At first he thinks they're sleeping, and he goes over, and to his horror, there's a naked girl, a bound boy, and they're both dead. The police mobilize, and this also has effect on Hong Kong society. Allegations of racism will come in later. We have 400 police officers. The Hong Kong regiment is mobilized. Everyone is going up these mountains and hills and streams, searching for evidence. And they find the stick. The stick had apparently fallen into a stream or been thrown into a stream, and it had, I guess it got caked with a little mold or seaweed, or not seaweed.
Pond scum and algae.
And they could access the blood underneath that. But the problem was the Hong Kong police were not well trained in taking evidence with regard to fingerprints because a couple of the police officers handled the stick. Now, the prosecution wasn't going to tell the defense that, but that's another matter. It was a huge issue because the murder weapon could actually get debunked if it went to trial without further evidence, because police officers' fingerprints were all over the stick too. This was a learning lesson for the Hong Kong police, and they started to perfect forensic with regard to fingerprinting. So those are 2 of the plus on the administrative side of what comes out of this case. So now, socially speaking, as I was saying, there's a racist element came out during this case, mainly by the Chinese press. The Chinese press came out and saying, hey, if 2 Chinese kids were killed like this, you wouldn't mobilize 400 police officers and the Hong Kong regiment on behalf of the Chinese victims. This is hard to say. I can personally attest, being of both races, that there certainly was prejudice here in 1985. I would say there was prejudice here, English prejudice here, all the way up to 1997. There was a superiority complex. The Chinese allegation that you'd only look this way for white folks, it's not completely without merit, but I don't think it applied to this case. So what I want you to do is bear in mind how these people were killed. This wasn't a simple rape. This was a torture. If someone did that to Chinese kids, I would hope the Hong Kong police would have, pulled all the stops out and gone after this. I would think they would have done that. I don't see any police force in good conscience allow, 5 gang members that commit this type of act to be roaming around free. Another reason I don't think the case was influenced by racism because the Hong Kong police had put up $50,000 reward for any information coming to this. And the English cops had, the head inspectors were basically hitting a wall. They weren't getting anywhere. And one of the top policemen, I think his name was MacKillop, spoke to one of his subordinates, a Chinese officer, who then took some of the pictures of the death of Nicola, and he went and showed them to some of his contacts. And a Chinese businessman who remained anonymous, we still don't know who he is, and when he saw the pictures of what had been done to Nicola, he immediately put up a $500,000 reward. So now the reward is $550,000, and in 1985, that's a good sum of money. On the issue of racism and the accusations of racism, there are two elements that I'll address. One is that the head of the Organized and Serious Crime Bureau, Braemar, he was accused of being a racist by the Chinese press during this time. The only possible element that I see in this case occurred when another gang of Chinese thugs were running about raping people. And this gang was arrested, and they confessed to 8 rapes. So as far as Merrick was concerned, this was the same gang that must have harmed Kenneth and Nicole. And he wanted a confession from them for that crime. However, they unanimously refused to having anything to do with Kenneth and Nicole. And at one point, Merrick basically told Chief Inspector MacKillop to get a confession out of them, the implication being to beat it out of them if necessary. MacKillop refused to do this, and he believed this gang had nothing to do with the murders on Braemar Hill. And he refused to force a confession. This was 5 months into the investigation, so it was a good thing MacKillop stood his ground and had some serious integrity on this. So on the other hand, you might be able to see there is possibly some justification of racism by the Chinese press. Now, the second incident is, I think, a lot more significant and disturbing. And this was 2 weeks before the murder had occurred. There was a British lady who, on a daily basis, would walk her dog through the Braemar Hills area. And she was assaulted and brutally raped by a Chinese man. However, she did not report it. Why didn't she report it? Now, at that time, being raped is bad enough, but being raped by a Chinese man, there could be a social stigma to that would make it worse. And she was also the wife of a senior police officer. So I guess it could be somewhat embarrassing for a police officer's for this to happen to a police officer's wife. But regardless, they did not report this crime. And the shame is that if they had reported it, it would have been known to all of Hong Kong that there was danger in Braemar Hills. And the chain reaction would possibly be that Kenneth and Nicola would not have been where they were when they were killed, because everyone would have been on the lookout, everyone would have been aware this area was a dangerous area, and there was a rapist, a brutal rapist, on the loose in that area. Those are the other two elements of this incident that tends to be overlooked. But nevertheless, that was an issue that was, that came out of this, that emphasized the racism. And I'm not so sure if it's actual racism, or perhaps maybe class structure between the rich and the poor might have been a better argument. Anyway, the police still cannot find the killers. They're not getting anywhere, even with this reward out. And then two developments occur. The first one is pretty bizarre. It is a Chinese fruit seller who doesn't speak English or speaks broken English. And it's reported by the Chinese press, and it's confirmed by the Hong Kong police, that she either became possessed or she was granted psychic visions and the ability to fluently speak English. And these visions enabled her to see what had occurred. So, you know, there were some that said the spirit of Nicola had come to this woman. Although it's interesting that Nicola spoke multiple languages, so she could cross those barriers. So this fruit seller went to the police station and reported the matter to the police. The police called in their clinical hypnotist, and his name, Dr. 𝐂𝐤𝐥𝐿, fully examined the woman and said she had credence, she was fully believable. And what the woman told the police was much detailed information that the police did not release to the public. That was incredible for the police. And she also gave them information that they did not have at the time, but would prove to be true later. So that was what was reported. Now back to a more traditional method of investigation and cracking a case. It was reported that now at this time you have that huge reward out there, $550,000. And what happens is a lieutenant from the 𝐒𝐞𝐫𝐢𝐥𝐿 Triads called in to the police and basically started giving them information. And he identified Pang as one day coming into one of the Triad parlors and bragging about what he had just done. And this was apparently done in front of the Triad boss. I don't know how much can be believed here or not, but the bottom line, this is what the lieutenant's saying. So now the police have a name. They got Pang's name. And they go ahead and arrest him. And he squeals immediately. He tells us, he surrenders the name of everyone who was involved. So the police go and pick these guys up. And Tam, you know, he was the second worst guy in this whole scene. When he killed Kenneth with Pam, he took Kenneth's sneakers. When Tam got arrested, he was still wearing Kenneth's sneakers. That's very strong evidence. So the police are now getting on firmer ground. Then the police officer in charge, MacKillop, he sits down with Wong, who's the youngest. And he just sat there. He didn't bully him or anything. He just sat there in quiet, asking a question or two, but mainly trying to be friendly and using patience. And Wong confessed everything. And in return for turning state's evidence, he'd become the prosecutor's and start witness. Apparently all readily confessed, except for Pang. Pang, while he identified the others, I don't think he actually admitted his guilt. 𝐒𝐞𝐫𝐢𝐥𝐿 Triads are actually a subgroup of the 𝐂𝐫𝐢𝐥𝐥 or 𝐂𝐫𝐤𝐤 Triads. And there has been speculation that the Triads would never turn on one of their own. So this story about the lieutenant in the Triads turning him over to Pang over to the police would be unbelievable. I disagree with that. I think it was very smart for the Triad leaders to turn Pang over. First of all, Pang was a lowly foot soldier. You wouldn't even consider him, he wasn't even on a fighter level. He's not even on street fighter level. He's lower than that. This kid's a bully. And the Triads would not condone something like this because it generates so much heat that all this heat will now come into their business districts where they're making their money. So this is a problem you want to get rid of. And if you can get $550,000 while getting rid of the problem, why not? But the story stops at the lieutenant. So it's apparently he got the reward, and it's speculated he fled with it or wouldn't have a good life with it. But I would say there's a very strong possibility he was authorized to do this, and the money simply just went into the coffers of the organization who authorized him to do it. But That's my speculation. All right, so we're done with the triads on this. This is now an issue that needs to get to court, but we still have a problem because the police, while they have confessions, they don't actually have a lot of the physical evidence they have is contaminated. It's such as a stick. And so what the police do is they talk to all 5 of these guys, and all 5 of them agree and volunteer to go back to the scene and walk through it, reenact it. And this is going to become very strong evidence later, because you now have the 5 guys there explaining exactly what happened on tape. So you can always challenge a confession witness statement, signed it under duress. I was beaten or whatever, I was threatened. But this is a videotape. So this becomes very strong evidence that's very hard to refute. So the case is heard by Justice O'Connor, and basically 2 counts of murder for each one of them, and they are all found guilty. Pang remained silent during the case, and basically the other 4 blame Pam for everything. But duress is not a defense for murder under any circumstance, and that's just simple law. So we can get into that a little bit more, but I'm going to leave it at that for right now, and because now this case, this incident is in the realm of the courts. So now it's more about analyzing the law. Well, I would like to now speak to the law with regard to this matter. All the defendants were convicted on indictment of 2 counts of murder. The first thing that jumps out to me is why there were not further indictments for other crimes that occurred here, such as the rape. I've been informed that, or advised that in Hong Kong, they like to get the heaviest charge at that time and just run with that. Whereas in other societies like the United States, they would have thrown the rape charges on and whatever else they could have come up with, which would have meant more years of imprisonment, unless it runs consecutively. Anyway, the defendants, some of them, appealed the decision. Now, Pang, defendant number 1, he never testified. D2, which is Tam, D4, which is Tung, and D5, which is Qiu. The appeal was heard in case number 40 of 1987, Court of Criminal Appeal, and they basically submitted 6 grounds of appeal. Now, 4 of them are grounds that, in essence, challenge the judge's directions to the jury and or the lack of directions. They basically said the judge should have directed the jury to consider A, B, or C. But the bottom line is these 4 directions or lack of directions revolved around inferences, the wording in terms such as intention, conscience relating to a standard of proof, the difference between intention and desire, the required standard of proof. Anyway, the Court of Appeal easily, I would say, dealt with these 4 grounds simply by relying on established legal principles and precedents set by other cases. For example, the diplock direction that in essence explains proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So those 4 grounds were dismissed pretty quickly. Which brings us to the last 2 grounds. The defense objected to the prosecution using the videotape recording of the defendants when they went back to the scene of the crime. And they basically argued this inflamed the minds of the jury. This was highly prejudicial and it was unfair. And there is some case law that supports part of this argument, which is as follows. Number 1, you can't use a videotape recording after the defendants have been charged and they're represented and then go and reconstruct the crime scene. The judge will have the discretion to disallow that. Secondly, the police cannot use a video recording after the person has been charged as a further statement from the defendant. The judge can also disallow that. However, so that's what the defendants were basically arguing, that the video had to be removed. Because you remember, when the video is an issue of sight, the jury is now seeing the defendants walking through the crime scene, especially as some of the defendants were speaking, such as Tam. He said, "This is where we took their belongings and threw them in that direction." Such as Chee-hwa, who said, "This is where we killed them." And he identified the spots of where we killed them. And he's saying verbally, "This is where we killed them." So that's very damning. And a jury is going to take that very seriously. So, so the defense is really trying to get this knocked out. However, and I told you the two grounds where a judge can dismiss it. However, in this instant, the police did not do a full reconstruction with the defendants. They walked the defendants through the crime scene. They basically traced the route of the crime scene. It was not a full reconstruction. The other issue was the prosecution pointed out that all the defendants had agreed, they had consented to return to the scene of the crime, and specifically, they had consented to trace the route of how they went up there that day to Braemar Hills, and then how they exited. So this was agreed before they were formally charged. However, due to the issue of arranging transport, by the time the video recording occurred, they had been formally charged. Nevertheless, the Court of Appeal held that this was not a further statement. They had volunteered to do this, so there's no unfairness. And they also said there's no prejudice in a murder case because every piece of evidence pointing to murder is already prejudicial. And they basically felt that the trial judge had ruled properly by allowing the videotape to remain in evidence. The last grounds for appeal argued by the defense was that the trial judge should have instructed the jury that the plea of guilty by Wong should not be taken in any way as being adverse to or indicating the guilt of the others. Defense counsel contended that after the jury heard Wong's guilty plea and the damning evidence against the other defendants, that a jury would inevitably have to conclude the other defendants were guilty. So my first thought is the defense should have done a better job cross-examining Wong or trying to discredit his evidence. They had the chance to do that. They had the opportunity to do that. They didn't. They failed. My next thought is the other defendants also had the opportunity to distance themselves from Wong's guilty plea and all the evidence that was part of that guilty plea. And they failed. They didn't do a good job doing that. The jury didn't believe them. And then lastly, Wong's guilty plea had to be part of the case. He's part of the case. He's a star witness in it. So you're going to hear what he says. His evidence, regardless, is extremely material to the case. How can you ask a judge, the trial judge, to instruct the jury to forget what they heard? It cannot be unheard. It's in the minds of the jury. So I completely agree with the Court of Appeal when they stated the trial judge did nothing wrong and this was not a ground for appeal. And with that ended D2, that's Tam. That ended his appeals. And I want to also point out one thing about Tam, if I didn't mention it before. Before he was arrested, he was running around in canvas sneakers, and he bragged where he got these sneakers. He bragged to some people that he killed someone and took them from the boy. So this is a person I don't think had any remorse. And again, I said, I was informed that he died in prison due to cancer, although I've also heard maybe the medical leave was granted shortly before he passed. So this ends the story of Tam. However, D4 and D5, that's Chung and Chiu, advanced another ground for appeal. And this was the ground of duress. In essence, they said they only did what they did because they were afraid of Pang. Pang threatened them that if they didn't do it, he would kill them. They tried to use this as a defense in an attempt to bring it down to manslaughter. The argument of duress as a defense for murder actually has a fascinating history that goes all the way back to the Emperor Justinian. But the long and short of it is duress has never been available as a defense for the act of murder. So this ground was also rejected. I could really dive into duress as a defense, but we still got a little ways to go. Today I'm here with Chief Inspector Norman MacKillop. At the time, with regard to the Braemar Hill murders, Norman was the Chief Inspector on the matter. Now, everything that I've said so far was based on verified sources, such as the court orders, and it was based on unverified sources, such as YouTube speculation, biased reports, and even inaccurate police reports. So with the objective to get to the truth, last week I had the privilege of meeting Norman, and we sat down and we spoke for about an hour, hour and a half, and he told me some things that were stunning to me with regard to what's accurate and what is not accurate. Now, Norman was tasked with securing justice for Kenneth and Nicola, and I've deliberately left my previous analysis untouched so you will see the errors I made based on the misinformation that is out there. So without further ado, let's welcome Chief Inspector Norman MacKillop. I'll just call you Norman.
Yeah, please do, Sean. I'm happy to come here to help you establish the facts.
Excellent, sir. Excellent. So now, let's just jump right into this, okay? So one thing maybe you can clear up for me is I've heard two stories. I'd like to know, was Pang, the primary instigator in this whole incident, was he staying on a hut in the Braemar Hills area, or did he come to the Braemar Hill area with the other four from Kowloon on the day of the incident?
Actually, months down the road, when we established the identities of the gang, we discovered that Pang was actually living in a disused quarry, in a wooden hut. We'd call it a squatter hut, with his father at the time, which it was in walking distance of Braemar Hill.
Okay, so he would be very familiar,
yes,
with these hills. I see. Now, some YouTubers have caused confusion with regard to Kenneth's injury. Some people say he pulled a muscle. They cannot imagine him breaking his collarbone because he was captain of the rowing team. But but the other one is he had a broken collarbone. Can you put this to rest once and for all? What was Kenneth's injury before the incident?
Broken collarbone.
Broken collarbone.
He was a sporty young man, and he'd broken his collarbone a few days before, and his arm was in a sling, so he was in a very, very bad condition to defend himself or defend Nicola.
Yeah, I see. Okay. Now, let's speak about the police investigation, because again, there's some crazy theories floating out there. Now, it was alleged that there was approximately 18,000 leads, and in essence, the investigation team was getting overwhelmed, and a gentleman by the name of Trevor Collins had to fly back to the UK in order to learn a new computer system, which was then brought back to Hong Kong. It was implemented, and allegedly, this 18,000 leads reduced to 180 suspects. Can you clear this up for us?
I don't know where this is coming from, but Trevor Collins, who was the Chief Inspector in B Division, I was the Chief Inspector in A Division, a very close friend and a close colleague of mine throughout my years in Hong Kong Police. We're still good friends to this day. Trevor, as I said, was the Chief Inspector in B Division. B Division they had their own cases, of course, but they were tasked to assist me. So we worked very, very closely. At that time, B Division was tasked with handling the exhibits. A very, very important task of dealing with the scene of crime, handling the exhibits going forward. For Trevor to scoot off to England to go on some ludicrous course with some magic computer program that was going to help us is ludicrous. I couldn't afford to have Trevor leave me at that time. But I will say that around about the time of the Braemar Hill case, there was a new system of instigated in the United Kingdom, in the Metropolitan Police, called the Holmes system, HOLMES, named after, obviously, Sherlock Holmes. It's a Home Office large major inquiry system. But at that time, of course, we'd heard about it, but it was in its infancy. It was years down the line before it was of any use even to the UK police. The system was hopefully designed to integrate all the information, statements from witnesses, people who were seen at the scene, the crime, the exhibits, and all the information on the case, primarily to link up serial killers cases like that. It didn't work very well. It wasn't of much use for several years down the line. And don't forget, in Hong Kong, our primary language is Chinese.
Yes.
And the Holmes computer couldn't handle Chinese. So it was virtually no use to us. So the story about basically my right-hand man, Trevor, being shunted off to learn some useless computer program is ridiculous.
Very good. Thank you for clearing that up. So now another issue. It was asserted that forensic fingerprinting in Hong Kong in the 1985 was in its infancy, and that the police were not trained in following how to gather evidence related to fingerprinting.
Again, that's ludicrous. And in the 80s, Hong Kong was probably at the forefront of forensic science. We had some of the best forensic scientists in the world. Jack Ballantyne, Dr. Clark, and they were all in a unit headed, which was under the cover of the government chemistry department. They were world-renowned experts. And as far as fingerprints were concerned, we had the intrepid Bruce Ferguson, Superintendent Bruce Ferguson, and his identification bureau, who had, again, some of the world's foremost fingerprint experts. Now, fingerprints had been accepted by the courts in the UK and also Hong Kong since 1901. Fingerprint evidence was in existence and was becoming common. And in Chinese culture, it existed for well over 1,000 years, and going right back to the Qing dynasty.
Fantastic.
So at the time when the Braemar Hill case occurred, we were at the forefront of fingerprint technology. So I don't know where this story came from, but again, it's ludicrous.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
But as we're still on the evidence, and related to the fingerprints, is the main weapon of the incident was a stick. And again, there were stories that it was covered with pond scum or algae, and it was difficult to get the prints off because too many people handled the stick. Can you tell us what was the stick?
In fact,
how was it found?
Well, strangely enough, the main part of the stick was found by me. Myself and Inspector 𝐂𝐫𝐢𝐥𝐿, who was again very, very prominent in the case, took a walk, an extended walk around the scene before the PTU arrived, the Police Tactical Unit.
Okay.
And as we were walking down the stream at Cecil's right, I noticed a piece of wood, a stick, in the stream. It was quite a fast-flowing stream, but it struck me that it seemed out of place. The reason being that at one end of the stick there was some mud or earth, which the color was not consistent with the surrounding mud in the stream, and the fact that the mud was still there seemed inconsistent with it having been there a long time, and therefore it must have been there for a short time.
Okay, because the mud and the stick was in the stream.
Yes.
The water would wash the
Exactly.
mud off eventually.
So I thought it was rather strange, and the murder we'd realised had occurred the evening before. So this was in the afternoon, the following day. So I carefully fished the stick out, and it became an exhibit, and it was examined forensically. And Trevor, in fact, took that stick back to the UK, to the forensic laboratories in the UK, because they developed some advanced technology there. We found there was human blood on the stick, but there was insufficient to identify the blood type, so we couldn't tie it to Nicola. But later on in the case, through the confessions of the culprits, we learned that stick had been used as part of the assault weapon. And later, the other part of the stick was found, and they matched up. So that matched up and corroborated the stories of some of the defendants who said that a stick was used on not only Nicola, but on Kenneth, and broken two at one stage.
That's actually also in the court order. How large was this stick?
That's about this, let me see, is say about 2 feet.
2 feet.
About 2 feet.
How thick are we?
About as thick as my arm, which is not very thick nowadays.
Okay. Still thick. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, so that covers the stick. Now, there were two other incidents, I don't know if it's urban legend, that has come out in this case. Now, no, one is actually, it wasn't urban legend, it was actually quite serious in the press, but we don't know how much validity there is to it. And this is an allegation of racism that was made against the head of Organized and Serious Crime Bureau, Brian Merritt, by the Chinese press. This Kate Whitehead wrote a book about this. And she had basically said that another Chinese gang, about 5 months into the investigation, had been arrested for other rapes that was occurring. And it was alleged that Merrick wanted you to get a confession out of this Chinese gang, and it was implied by whatever means necessary. And accordingly, you refused to do this. You held your ground, and I speak a bit about to this in the first part of this before I met you, regarding your serious integrity on this matter. So can you explain what happened there? How did you know this gang was not the Braemar Hill guys? Was Merrick, bringing in, were the Chinese press justified in making allegations of racism?
Well, the two issues are probably, I would treat them separate. So
Okay.
let's deal with the racism first.
Sure.
I was aware into the investigation, of course we were following the press, and there were hints of, why were we using so much manpower for this case and so many resources, because, it must be because it was two European kids. I'm actually really offended by this kind of stupid allegation, because I'd been involved prior to that in many, many murder cases and many serious crimes. And of course, the vast majority involved Chinese victims. And I'd used in some cases more resources than they were using in this case, because each case, the resources that we use depends on the issues surrounding the case.
Yes.
Where's the scene of crime? In this case, Braemar Hill is a pretty rugged piece of ground. In fact, it's the whole of central Hong Kong is rugged jungle, mountain, trekking trails, and surrounded in the most part, particularly in the north part, by central Wan Chai, eastern Quarry Bay, etc., surrounding this vast central area. And of course, the scene of crime for this case was on the edge of Braemar Hill was on the edge of Braemar Mansions, North Point, Quarry Bay, etc. And we had very little clues. From the body, the only exhibits we could find immediately were books scattered around which belonged to Kenneth and Nicola, who had been studying in that evening, outdoors. So we needed a lot of manpower immediately to not only to help us. You've probably seen in films of murder inquiries of lines of policemen,
Yes.
scouring every inch of ground in a line.
Yes.
This is what we needed, right? And this was not just for one day for the scene of crime. We needed the manpower to find witnesses. We had no witnesses to this crime. But there was a lot of people would go trekking in that area. So we had to try and identify who was in that area at the time. Trekkers, innocent people, who may have seen something that at that time they didn't think twice about it, but now if we found that potential witness, they would be able to identify who else was in the area at that time. So that was our exercise going forward, as well as the immediate need to search the scene of crime for potential murder weapons or things that perpetrators had dropped, and also witnesses in the immediate vicinity as soon as possible after the occurrence of the crime. So we needed manpower, and it wasn't just our own division.
The Hong Kong regiment?
No, we didn't use the Hong Kong regiment.
Okay.
The Hong Kong regiment of volunteers, to get them out of bed as quick as we wanted, it wouldn't be easy.
But were they on the hill with you?
No.
That's another...
We already have, in each region in Hong Kong, Kowloon East, Kowloon West, Hong Kong Island, and New Territories, they have at any time, they have a platoon, a company of police tactical unit available for the regional commander to deploy in whichever way he wants. So we had plenty of manpower immediately on hand who were professional police officers. There was no way we would call out the volunteers of the Hong Kong regiment.
So that never happened?
I don't even believe it existed at that time.
Wow.
Anyway.
Okay.
That never happened.
Okay.
But we really did need manpower. But as I said, I use similar in many other cases. A murder in Chee-hwa estate has probably one of the largest single connected residential building in the world. And we had a murder in that building. I needed PTU on that Sunday morning to come and help me do door-to-door inquiries. So it was ludicrous and quite insulting to suggest that it was racist. Just after the Braemar Hill case was dealt with, I was on other cases, and for example, a young girl in Lam Tin estate, again a housing estate, who was found raped and murdered. And I needed PTU then. So there was in any of these cases, I was never denied any of the resources that I needed, that I thought I needed. Never. On racial grounds, that's ridiculous.
Okay.
Now getting on to the Bride Merit issue, he was the chief superintendent of Organized Crime Bureau.
Okay.
Of which my division was a division. And he also had under his charge Criminal Intelligence Bureau, etc., etc. So part of our investigations, bearing in mind that we had virtually no eyewitnesses, we had virtually no forensics, we never had any leads at that time. Where the 180,000 leads, I don't know where that came from. But anyway, part of our method was to try and establish, looking at the modus operandi that we believed occurred in this case. There was a minimum of 3.
Okay.
Don't forget, although Kenneth had his arm in his sling and would probably not be able to put up much of a fight, Nicola was a 17-year-old, very strong, healthy, sporty girl. In my experience, it's not easy to kill someone. They're going to fight for their life.
Yes.
Right. So it would be inconceivable, but there would only be one perpetrator, or even 2. One would have to hold Kenneth, despite his arm in a sling. He's still a fit young man. And the other one would have to deal with Nicola. So no, that's not likely. So minimum 3, likely to be more. And of course, we had violence, and we had the sexual assault.
Multiple times.
Multiple. So, and it's like a country park area. So we looked at previous cases, and if we found cases that were similar, we investigated these cases as if it was a homicide. And we looked at the witnesses and retook their statements as if they were witnesses to a murder. So we really dug into these old cases. And not only that, going forward, as the investigation proceeded, we looked every day at the morning reports of crimes coming in from all over the different districts and looking for cases of similar MO. So anyway, we built up a picture of cases that were starting to occur in Kowloon of a gang of young males accosting young couples in public parks, robbing them and raping or indecently assaulting the female. And we found several of these cases. So I put a memo together for senior officers and decided that we would reinvestigate these cases on the proviso that if we made arrests and it was determined that they were not our Braemar Hill suspects, we would move on immediately, call in the local police, take over this case and move on. Don't lose sight of our focus on the Braemar Hill case. So that's what happened. So we focused on a gang who were involved in similar type cases. We used various means, surveillance, information, and surveillance primarily, and we established their identities. We established where we could pick them up, and we put on an operation, and we arrested them all. Brought them back to our headquarters and interrogated them.
Okay, but they refused to admit to anything.
No, they
with Braemar.
When they realized that we were the team dealing with the Braemar murder, they, to use the colloquial term, they coughed on all the cases they'd done in Kowloon region, but they were adamant they had nothing to do with the Braemar Hill case. And of course, we're not going to take this at face value, but we've got lots of experience and we have lots of resources and forensic resources. And so we wanted to bring this to a conclusion as quickly as possible. If it was not the gang we were looking for the Braemar case, we wanted to drop it immediately, gather all the evidence together, bundle it up, call the Kowloon team in and say, there's your case, you get on with it, thank you very much, and we move on. And that's exactly what happened.
Okay, but what about Merrick? Why was he convinced these guys were the same?
Well, I was convinced they weren't.
Okay.
But I'm not going to jump into his mind.
Okay.
But I do believe that he briefed the Commissioner of Police prematurely once we made the arrests, because my memo was very, very clear. These are suspects because of a similar modus operandi. That's it.
Yeah.
That's all we had at this time. But they were clear suspects. We had no other suspects.
Okay.
Right? But they were suspects. There was no surety that this was the gang. It was never suggested that this was the gang. It was suggested that they've got a similar MO and they're the only gang that is operating with this MO as far as we know. And it's similar to the gang or the group that we believe.
So
that's it.
Only difference is this particular Kowloon gang never crossed that line into murder, even though they did bad things.
No.
Okay. Now,
so anyway, we moved on.
Okay.
And when I decided to move on, I moved on.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay. Good enough. Good enough. So now, during my research, I came across this story, which was very striking, very odd to me, and unsettling. And this was about a British lady who, 2 weeks prior to Kenneth and Nicola being attacked, she had also been raped, apparently brutally, in Braemar Hills by a Chinese man. And she was married to a British police officer or senior police officer. That's what 𝐂𝐫𝐢𝐥𝐿 reported. So, but this was never reported to the police. However, she did eventually come forth later. Can you tell me what happened here?
Well, who she was married to is not relevant, but yes, a woman did come forward to us after the arrest of the Braemar Hill gang. And she gave a statement to us saying that she'd been raped by a single male and brutally raped when she was out jogging in the Cecil's Ride area, very close to where the Braemar Hill murder had occurred. And she came forward. She didn't come forward initially because, of course, she was ashamed, which just happens for huge percentage of rape victims, sadly, they don't come forward because they're ashamed or afraid. But she realized that this person might have been one of the Braemar Hill gang. So she came forward. So we took her statement and we investigated the crime in so much as the description that she gave us of her assailant was very similar to Pang San-yi. Now, Pang was quite a strange-looking character. He had a very long torso, short legs, quite powerfully built, and pretty fierce character. So we were able to establish that if it was one of the gang, it would be him, not the others, because they're dissimilar in appearance. So we put a formal identification parade together. Now that's an identification parade that's composed of the suspect and 7 so-called actors, who we pay $50 at Hong Kong to come and be a part of an identification parade. And it's held under very strict rules. It's adjudicated and recorded by an independent superintendent of police who would be uniform branch, not connected with our criminal investigation department. Everything will be recorded in an identification book, so it's a very, very regulated process. When the lady was brought in to view the lineup, she immediately picked out Pang San-yi, and we took a further statement, of course, and to clarify how could she identify him and was she sure, etc. She was sure. So that was the bonus for us, in my view, at the time, because although we'd made the arrest, we had very limited corroborating forensic evidence. In my view, if there was a trial and for some reason we weren't able to convict Pang San-yi, we still had the rape case.
Okay.
Right, but we didn't proceed with it at that stage, which is quite normal in Hong Kong. So we proceeded with the murder and we got the conviction. So the rape case was, to use a technical term, was held on file.
What does that mean, held on file?
It means if we need to resurrect it, the evidence is there, the witness is there, and we can proceed with the prosecution. So we decided not to proceed with the prosecution because after the conviction of the Gang of Five, it wouldn't be in the public interest.
Okay, it'd just be a waste of money because he has a life sentence anyway.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. It wasn't left on file to shield the identifier of the. That wasn't the primary reason. It's a normal thing to leave a case like that on file.
Okay. Okay. So, well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I think you've put the race issue to bed. There's no true racial elements. So let's just put the class issue to bed. Would the police search harder for the wealthy versus poor Chinese victims?
No, just as we'd prosecute the wealthy just as fiercely as we'd defend the poor Chinese victims.
Okay.
Absolutely no basis for that.
Okay.
And there's been many wealthy people prosecuted in Hong Kong.
Very good. Okay, so let's move on to another story that was published by the Chinese press. And I found this one a bit bizarre, but people have given it credence. And it was claimed that a Chinese fruit seller became possessed by Nicola's spirit.
I'm sorry, I can't help but smiling.
Okay, who then came to the police with details that had not been released to the public, and furthermore had gave the police information that they were unaware of, which later proved to be true. And then the police had a clinical hypnotist, Dr. Patrick Yeung, who allegedly confirmed this woman to be believable. So, first of all, do you know Patrick? Is he a hypnotist? Was there a fruit seller?
Well, I vaguely remember some story about the Chinese fruit seller who was running around trying to say that she was possessed and had various information. I can tell you that I would not have wasted 1 microsecond pursuing that line of inquiry, and I did it. But as far as Patrick is concerned, Patrick Young was at that time, I think he was a chief inspector in the traffic department, police traffic department, with some interest in hypnotism and some. Prior to the Braemar case, I'd never met him. But anyway, as I said, getting back to our lack of witnesses, we had a couple of people that we'd found, that ladies who'd seen some men down near the stream where we found a piece of wood a day, or they weren't sure of the exact day. So we thought maybe Patrick Young can use his skills to enhance their memories. So we thought we'd give it a try. But there's a danger in using this, because in our jurisdiction and the British legal system, if a witness has been subject to hypnotism, then we can't use them in court. The reason being that there's lots and lots of research to show that people under hypnotism are very susceptible to suggestions. Yeah. So you can suggest that they saw something, and they would believe that, yes, I did see something like that. So we don't use them. So we had to be very careful. But as I said, we were pretty desperate. The 180,000 leads was nonsense. We had very few leads, and very few witnesses who were actually helpful. So we had to be very careful. We knew that these two witnesses were not crucial, but if their recollection could be enhanced, they might give us some clues which would then lead to other evidence. So we had to be very careful and very sparing in using that sort of so-called hypnotism. We'd never done it before. And I sat in on Patrick's session. I was quite impressed. He was able to zoom in, or ask the witnesses to zoom in to the Nike shoes that one of them was wearing, and describe the color, and one of the shoes, the laces had been undone, and things of that nature. So it was very interesting, but at the end of the day, it didn't help us.
Okay.
We tried, but it didn't help us.
Okay.
It was of no real value to us. It didn't lead us to establishing any facts.
So you're coming up.
So the lady who was
the fruit seller.
The fruit seller, I think maybe she's still selling fruit. I don't know, but she was of no.
Okay.
No value.
Was there a fruit seller?
I have no idea. And as I said, if there was, I wouldn't have wasted 1 microsecond in even pursuing it.
Okay, good enough. So now it seems like you're lacking in clues.
Yeah.
$500,000 or $550,000 reward has been put up by this time. And another story that comes out is that there's a Triad lieutenant in the Fukihing Triads, a subgroup of the Chu-Chao Triads, and he comes forward for the reward and tells the police that Pang basically bragged about the incident, and Pang's the guy you want. And he then moves forward, trying to help you get Pang. So now, first of all, how much truth is there to this Triad element? And true or not, what was the operation that actually affected the arrest of Pang and his gang?
Okay, let's deal with the Triad issue. The Triad issue was never a factor in our investigations. This was quite clear to us. It was a group of thugs involved in a killing frenzy. There was no Triad issue. And don't forget that we were the organized serious crime and Triad bureau at that time. So we were well au fait with the Triads. So the Triad factor, if this informant had been a Triad or not, is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. It's nothing to do with the case. But an informant did come forward.
Okay.
And one of the primary reason, of course, was the reward. And the reward was in this case a very, very important factor in the success of the operation. In my experience and other police officers experience, when there's a crime of this nature perpetrated by more than one, it increases the odds that someone's going to talk in some circles about, it wasn't me who fired the gun, it was him who fired the gun. I don't know why I'm on the run because he did it, or they try and diminish their culpability in a conversation, or in this case boast.
In this case, they boasted of what they did.
So it was a little snippet that came out to us, and it was an overheard conversation by someone who was not a member of the group, but knew of him, knew Pang. So he knew who was saying this. Didn't know his full name, didn't know where he lived, didn't know the other members of the group. So it was a little snippet which was a godsend for us. For the first time in 6 months, we got something which may lead to bigger things.
So once you got that, what did you do?
Once we got that, this informant came to one of the detectives in our bureau and told him the story. So the detective was in fact not in my division, he was in Trevor's division, was seconded to my division. And we sat down and we thought, well, how are we going to develop this little snippet of information? And from that, it was developed over time. The informant was directed how to get close to this Pang, get closer, and get closer to his associates, and in fact become more into them. And over time, through putting surveillance on the informant, so without him knowing it, we were following him, and we were gradually not relying entirely on his information because he was going in and out, coming back to us. We used our own resources, which were quite significant at the time. Surveillance is not an easy job. It's not like the movies, one guy following another suspect. It's a whole team with command posts and vehicles and changes of shifts and all kinds of stuff. It's a very professional job. So this took some time. So with the informant giving us, building up his information and our surveillance and other information, we built a whole picture up of this gang, who they were and where they worked and where we could pick them up when the time came. So that's how it was developed. All through the information money being the incentive for the informant coming forward with a little snippet of information. He didn't say, well, there's the 5 murderers, this is where they live. It was just the name Pang and a description and what he said. It could have been totally untrue. We didn't know, but we decided to put all our eggs in that basket, and we were lucky we did.
Okay. During this process, so this is like in the 6th month that the informant comes through.
Yeah.
And I think the arrests were made 8 months after.
Yeah, about 7 months.
It's about 7 months. So as you're under this, as this surveillance is going on, are you able to get more information that others, like Tam, was part of the...
Yeah, we had to be very patient. We wanted to establish all of the members of the gang, their identities and where they lived, where they worked, so that at the end, when we were ready, we could put together a simultaneous arrest procedure. So we would arrest all the gang members at the same time.
Were they all in separate locations?
Yes.
Okay, so you have had 5 teams going out here?
Yes.
Okay.
More than 5 teams, plus the whole of the surveillance bureau backing us up.
Okay, so when you arrested Tam, you were on that team? The team to go get Tam?
Pang. Yes, I went. I took the team to arrest Pang.
Okay, and when that happened, where was this? What was your reaction when you saw the guy?
I just knew immediately, just by instinct, that's the right guy. Just by instinct.
Okay,
that's not evidence you can use in court, but we went into the wooden hut where he lived in that quarry, and he had his back and he walked away from us inside the hut, and he just looked a really strange character. Anyway, we arrested him, and he looked pretty evil, That's all I can say, but that's not evidence in court. Anyway, we took them all back. We had already arranged back at headquarters to receive these people. They each had their separate interrogation rooms. We had a plan to have a chief inspector supervising, a senior inspector doing the interrogation, a chief inspector supervising, all handpicked, very, very experienced people of integrity who are not going to do anything stupid which might jeopardize our case in court. We, for the first time, we used the audio for all the interviews. This has never been done before in the Hong Kong police.
Okay.
At that time, it was all written caution statements, as we say, and you write it down. There was no audios. Not like the movies you see now where they switch on the tape recorder.
Sure.
You know.
So this is the first case in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Audio
Yes.
evidence is actually used.
Yes, because we knew that with the lack of forensic, the lack of separate eyewitnesses, we would have to be relying 90% on any confessions. Now, confessions are notoriously difficult to preserve because there is a situation in Hong Kong and in our jurisdiction, same in the States, we have a voir dire. If there's a challenge to the statement, but voluntariness or something, or coercion, etc., then we have a trial within a trial.
Yes.
Before the main trial, for the judge to decide, are these statements, should they be allowed to go before the jury?
Yes.
Right? So we knew there was going to be a voir dire, inevitable in Hong Kong. So we did everything we did to protect that evidence. Because in this case, it was crucial. If there was a confession, we had to protect it. Because we knew there was down the road was going to be a challenge. Oh, he was coerced or threatened or something like that. We knew that.
Yes. There was many forms. One defendant said he wanted to please the police, so he exaggerated.
They do. Then even if when they give the confessions or the statements, when they go into remand, they're taught by other remand prisoners, oh, when you just say the police beat you up and all this sort of thing. And we did everything we did to preserve that evidence, to fend off any such future attack. That's why we use the audios. That's why we make very, very careful records of who was the witness and what's the integrity and the status of the witness who's witnessing. Every step of the way is safeguarded.
So talking about the interrogations, who did you interrogate?
One.
Did you interrogate any of the others?
No.
Just Wong.
Wong.
And before you said earlier, he pretty much let it all out.
Why did I choose him? Because I believed he would be the most likely to, he's the youngest.
Yes.
He would be the most likely to spill the beans.
Okay. And was that fairly quickly done?
Almost immediately.
Almost immediately.
Yeah.
Okay.
And under legal advice also, we put it to him that would he be willing to give evidence as a Crown witness. Yes.
Did he get anything for that?
No.
No. Okay, good.
Because he pleaded guilty prior to the main trial. You understand?
Yes.
So prior to the other four going on trial, one was brought before the court, pleaded guilty to the murders, and he then became a witness.
Okay. So that might help with his mitigation later on, that he pled guilty?
Yes.
Okay. Now, what about Tam? There were some stories around Tam that
Tam?
when he was arrested, it was alleged he was wearing Kenneth's sneakers.
He was.
He was.
He was.
And was he the one who was remorseful? Did he brag about it?
No, these other four were not remorseful. They were saying we only did because Pang threatened us.
Okay, but no one was sorry.
No, one was.
Just one.
One, the youngest, he did show, I think, genuine regret. But the others, no. They were all, it was Pang, he did it, and he forced us to do these evil acts.
Now, you said Hong Kong had a top-of-the-line forensics team.
Yes.
How did they determine these sneakers was Kenneth's sneakers?
Okay. So when Tam was arrested, we knew Kenneth's sneakers were missing, right? And they only had $1 on them. So there was anything of value. So this Tam obviously took, one of them had taken Kenneth's sneakers. So, and we knew what Kenneth's sneakers looked like. type of sneaker. When Tam was arrested, he had sneakers on that looked like, so of course we seized them. And I went to Hugh and Maggie McBride that same day and asked them to give us all of Kenneth's old shoes. And we took them to the forensic laboratory, as again, we have really state-of-the-art forensic and top-notch forensic scientists. And Dr. Clark, I had a long discussion with Dr. Clark, and they said, okay, what we can do is to try and analyze the shoe patterns, both inside the shoe and the wear patterns. And after a long period of examination and very scientific process, he was able to show that these shoes that we see from Tam had previously been worn by Kenneth. And Kenneth's wear and foot pattern had been superseded by Tam's wear and foot pattern.
Okay.
And during the trial, it was the analysis was very clear. The different shoe patterns were shown very clearly to the jury, and Dr. Clark explained very clearly how he could determine.
So this is like 100% solid.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
And defense never brought any experts to challenge it. I don't think they could have.
Okay. Very good. So talking about the defense, let's actually get to the court case itself. Now, all the defendants were indicted on 2 counts of murder. And I was noting before, and you mentioned you had the backup of the rape charge against Pang that could be used. But in other societies, such as the United States, they will, prosecutors will pile all the charges on, every charge they can think of. They'll pile it on. So notwithstanding what had happened to the English lady 2 weeks earlier regarding the incident, why did the Hong Kong police only charge murder when you could have had rape and probably other charges against all 5, but instead there was only 2 indictments for murder?
Okay, well, let me say that I can speak not only as a police officer in this instance, but I became a barrister in the United Kingdom after I left the Hong Kong police. So I'm aware of the legal issues. But why do we differ from the practice in the United States where they throw everything at them?
Yeah.
That must be hell of a confusing for the jury and the judge, when the jury have to be told in the summing up all the various factors of all the charges that they have to be sure of beyond a reasonable doubt, from murder to racketeering to all the other things you've thrown at them. So it must be hell of a confusing for the jury. So what we tend to do in our jurisdictions, common law Australia, in England, in Hong Kong, we tend to keep it as simple as possible for the jury. So in this case, the 2 primary charges, of course, were murder. Murder of Kenneth and murder of Nicola. Say, for example, they'd been carrying knives and we'd found knives when we arrested them. We could have charged them with possession of offensive weapons.
Sure.
Or we could have charged them also with wounding with intent to kill, as well as killing. I mean, when you think about it, that's be terrible confusing for the jury. When the murder, we only have murder and manslaughter. We don't have first, second, third degree murder. We just have murder with the mens rea, the intent to kill.
Yes.
Right? That's it.
Yes.
So it's fairly simple for the jury. Simple to convict and simple to kick the charge out.
Okay.
Right. So that's why we only charge 2.
Okay. I get it. Just to streamline the process, keep it free from any mess, and eliminate the defense's ability to confuse and muddy the waters up. Yeah,
if say, example, the firearms have been used and we'd caught them with firearms, we could charge them with possession of firearms and all kinds of things. But no, that evidence is used to show that the murder charge.
Okay, to put the solid grounding underneath the murder charge.
Yeah, we don't have to give an instruction to the jury or from the judge to say, like, what's the evidence you need to show that he possessed firearms? This is irrelevant.
Okay.
We're here to show that he killed that person with a firearm.
Yeah.
So evidence that he had possession of firearm, it's in the murder evidence anyway.
Okay, very good.
So,
okay. All right, so, well, that helps us understand the approach here in Hong Kong. versus other jurisdictions. So now, all the defendants were found guilty, and there was a total of 7 grounds for appeals. 4 of them were easily dismissed. It was basically regarding the judge's direction to the jury with regard to inferences, intention versus desire, standard of proof. So like the diplock direction basically eliminated those, which basically tells you beyond reasonable doubt how you reach that standard of proof. So that left 3 other grounds. And the ground of duress was dismissed because duress is not a defense for murder. Interesting subject, but easily dismissed. So, but there was 2 elements here. And now you had mentioned earlier that you started using audio tape, but in this instance, you also supplemented that with videotape, and you took the defendants out to the scene, and I believe walked them up the trail, walked them back down the trail, and some of these defendants actually made comments as they were on the video, and the jury gets to see all this. So you're beyond simply hearing, say from audio, you're now in the realm of sight. You're actually seeing these guys doing this. So the defense tried to knock this out. They basically said on 2 grounds. One, they basically said that you cannot reconstruct a crime after a person's been formally charged. And the second one was the police cannot use this as a further confession statement after a defendant has been formally charged. Now, one very key point was they agreed and consented to do this before they were formally charged. And tell me, so you brought them up back to Braemar Hills. So when you did that, you know, the defense argument, the scene was reconstructed. What would you say to that?
Well, there had been cases before where we'd use videotape of the accused being brought back to the scene. In this particular case, there was no reconstruction. We couldn't reconstruct the murder, brutal rape.
Yeah.
In this case, we needed further inquiries, right, for the interest of finding out what happened, because there was conflicting stories. And also, we weren't clear how these people had actually got to the scene, the exact route. And it was crucial that we could, because it was very, very thick bushes. So we'd found very few exhibits of any value, apart from the stick and Kevin and Nicola's books, which weren't of value they weren't probative of anything really. So we brought them back to clarify the stories, give them an opportunity to clarify the stories, how they got to the location, so we could actually search that area again.
This time you're following in their footsteps.
Yes. And we took the video to protect them, in a sense, that we weren't coercing them. We weren't trying to go there merely just to bolster their confessions before. That would have mean that would have been kicked out of evidence.
Yeah.
We had no right to, if we were just trying to reinforce the confessions which are evidence against them that we already had. That's what the appeal court said. You can't do that.
A further confess statement.
So the appeal court upheld that this wasn't a reconstruction. In fact, we also took the judge and the jury, together with the defendants, back to that same hill by helicopter. And in fact, the court convened at the scene of crime. It was all completely on video. So that wasn't a reconstruction.
Okay, fantastic.
So the appeal court said, no, this is not in the same category of the police trying to reinforce a statement by seeking to get further evidence to reinforce that statement by a so-called reconstruction. There was no reconstruction. The police had a legitimate reason to bring them back to the scene. They did it purely without any coercion. They volunteered. They volunteered.
Before they were formally charged.
Yes. So it was upheld. And in fact, I had further cases, another case a year later, a very similar type of case, which I did have a reconstruction. well knowing the cases that had been kicked out before because there was a reconstruction. But in this case, the defendant had said he didn't kill that person. There was a fictitious rubbish cleaner who was involved in the killing, and it didn't fit what we knew forensically, the injuries on the body. So it's okay. Would you come back to the scene and show us how it happened?
That's the 𝐿
Yeah, which he did. And I think probably that reconstruction was pretty crucial in the jury finding him guilty, because it was very clear during the video that he was lying, and he was making it up as he went along.
Okay.
Without a question from the police.
Okay, actually,
And that went all the way to the Privy Council, and the Privy Council said, that's fine.
Actually, let's talk about that some more. But before we get into that case, is there anything else that you have to say about the Braemar Hills? I've pretty much asked my questions, and thank you so much for, you've really cleared up a lot. You've debunked a lot of nonsense that's been out there, from the possessions, fruit sellers, to the triads, and the stunning revelation that Pang was actually up on that hill 2 weeks earlier. So yeah, I don't think anyone's ever heard that before. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing that with us. And but so before I get to the next case, is there anything else that sticks in your mind, like for anything with Chu and Tung? They're kind of downplayed. They don't really get as much of the spotlight as Pang and Wong and Tam, where they're just all dirtbags.
Well, you use the term. I'll probably support that.
Okay.
But they were the type of group that I remember way back in the days. If you got out of a taxi at the Star Ferry, there would be people coming to open your car door and with their hands out. They're that sort of group. Just the chances. I mean, on the day when they actually conducted the killings, they were out looking to steal copper.
That's right. That's right. From the substations.
Substations up there, that sort of thing. But one thing that has come up several times is the matter of Hugh and Maggie forgiving.
Oh yes, yes. It was alleged they sent a letter to Tung Chee-hwa.
It's no alleged. I know the family pretty well, and particularly Hugh and Maggie, and they were very, very devout Christians. Not just church-going Christians, but really, really devout Christians. And they actually forgave. I can say with certainty that they forgave certainly one. And they did petition for one to be shown some leniency.
Okay, Wong was the youngest.
The youngest.
And he was actually eventually let out.
He was, and he I believe was genuinely repentant. But that's not the issue. The issue is, yes, they did forgive. Whether or not they forgave, forgiving and suggesting that there's no retribution, it's not the same thing. For the others, I can't be sure that they forgive in their heart, for example, Pang.
Yes.
But forgiving doesn't mean that they would actually petition the governor to let Pang out early.
I hope not.
That's not the forgiveness. In their Christian hearts, maybe they can forgive, but that's a different thing. But for one, I think they did genuinely forgive him and did try to help him to get out earlier.
I see. Did they actually send a letter on behalf of Wong?
I believe that to be the case. Yeah.
Okay, I see. Well, I'm going to leave that like that right there. There is another interesting coming on the tail of that, is that Mary worked with 𝐒𝐤𝐥𝐸 with regard to assisting Wong. I believe after he got out, or
Mary.
Yeah, Mary, my wife.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
yeah. So maybe she'll follow up with a little, but I think we'll call it a day for Braemar Hill.
Okay.
Okay, and that's it. Thank you for tuning in, and a big thanks for Chief Inspector Norman MacKillop for really shedding some light and debunking a lot of the nonsense that is out there. and finally getting us some truth. Thank you again, Norman.
Happy to help. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.